So let's talk a little bit about constraints. Constraint checks are a feature that's been enabled on Wikidata for a few years for every logged in user. So if you're logged in and just browsing Wikidata and looking at some item, for instance, this random German video game developer that I found, then you might sometimes see these icons on some of these statements. I hope it's sharing my mouse cursor as well, after the CEO statement, who is supposed to be Mona Lisa. And that means that in the background, there was a constraint check running, and it found some issues with this, with some of the data in this item. And it's now trying to tell you what the issues are. You can look at them by clicking on this icon and see what exactly is supposed to be wrong with this statement. And it's showing you several constraint violations. In this case, the last one is the most important. So let's talk about that first. It's the value type constraint being violated, which says that values of CEO statements should be instances of human or fictional human, or a subclass of them. But Mona Lisa currently isn't, because the Mona Lisa is famously a painting and not a human. So somebody has decided on the CEO property that values of the property should always be humans. And that's currently not the case. And so you get shown this violation, and then you as a human now should decide what to do about it, if the value is incorrect or if it needs to be updated or something. There are also two more violations here. One is that the value should have a statement sex or gender, because apparently a CEO always needs to have a gender. And in this case, obviously, the Mona Lisa shouldn't actually have that statement. It just means that it's the wrong item to begin with. And then there's a third one, which says that the statement should also have a qualifier start time to inform people when they started to be the CEO. So that's actually not related to the wrong value here. It's more that the data is incomplete. And now you have to decide, in this case, probably just to remove this statement. It's from 2013, by the way. It's been here for a while. And that's one kind of issue that the constraints can tell you about, are these, what it calls here, potential issues. But a constraint can also be marked as just a suggestion. So here we also have a missing qualifier start time, but this time it's on the property interwiki prefix at Wikimedia. And this constraint has just been marked as a suggestion. So it's kind of saying, you might want to add, or you might want to look up when this interwiki prefix for Wikidata was first defined, and add that as a start time qualifier, but you don't have to. It's just a suggestion. So it gets this friendlier icon with a little flag. And then there's also a status called mandatory constraint, where you get the scary lightning bolt icon and the heading changes to issues instead of potential issues. And this one here says that the value for the formatter URL really should have a colon in it somewhere, except it doesn't. It's a relative URL. And then there's another constraint down here, which says not only should it contain a colon somewhere, it should in fact start with HTTP or HTTPS, or it should be an info, IRC, Skype, blah, blah, blah stuff. So that's a more specific constraint in this case, and someone has decided that this should just be a normal constraint, but the more general restriction that it should only have a colon somewhere in it, that one should be a mandatory constraint. I'm not sure what the correct solution to this one would actually be. Probably to say that the constraint only applies when the formatter URL is used as the main statement and not when it's used as a qualifier, but I'm not actually sure in this case. And the way that these constraint statuses are defined and everything else is as part of the constraint definition. And if you click these links in the headings, so format constraint, or earlier here in the value type constraint on the CEO statement, if you click those links, you get sent to the constraint definitions, which are just statements on the property in a separate section, but they're just normal statements using the special property constraint, which is P2302, I think. And then you have one of about, I think the extension knows roughly 3 dozen different constraint type items in here as the value of the statement, which defines what kind of constraint is this. Is this, for instance, a value requires statement constraint is the one we saw earlier that says a CEO should always have a gender statement, or the value type constraint with the parameters as well, defining that this should, the specific value type being demanded is that it should be an instance of human or fictional human. And then the third constraint up here, the type constraint, we didn't actually see in the pop-up. So this one says the object or the item that the statement appears on, the one that we're looking at, so in this case, the red something, whatever it was called, Red Wolf design, this item should be an instance of organization, fictional company, or branch office. And if you go back and look at the actual instance of statement, we see that it's actually an instance of video game developer, and yet there's no warning icon here, because a video game developer is a subclass of an organization, and the constraint checks take that into account. So if it's a subclass of an organization, including a transitive subclass or an indirect subclass, that's all fine. So that's why this is not counting as a violation. And all of these different constraint types used here as items are all documented on this page, the help property constraints portal. There's a short URL for it as well, where you can see this long list of all the different supported constraint types. Like allowed units is fun to say that the unit of a mass statement, for instance, should be some unit that can be converted into kilograms, and you can't have a mass of 2 meters. That doesn't make sense. Or a bunch of other useful constraint types. And each of those has a separate documentation page for this constraint type, which is also linked from the pop-up. You can see that here, the help link that points to the documentation page for a specific constraint type, like this one, for instance, the value requires statement constraint, which explains what is going on here. If you're not sure what the constraint even means, what can you do about it? For instance, here, the wrong value item might have been chosen, the Beatles, the White Album versus the Beatles, the band. In this case, earlier, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the wrong Mona Lisa item that was chosen. That was just random nonsense, I guess. And if you want to define the constraint yourself, it tells you what the parameters of the constraint are. So the possible qualifiers that you put on the statement that defines the constraint are property, the property of the statement that should be required, and optionally also which item should be required. So that's how you work with the constraints on Wiki. But is that my next slide? Yeah, okay. But how do you find constraint violations in the first place? It used to be possible to query them in the query service, but that is currently not working anymore. I think we're hoping to re-enable it, but what you can do at the moment is use this violation checker script, which is a Python script. So if you know how to run Python scripts locally, like if you've used PyWikibot before, for instance, then you can use this. And it takes as input a list of IDs. For instance, here I've put the IDs of Wikidata and this company from before, and then ran this check data quality script with the input file IDs, and it's told me that it's working and sending the IDs to the API, and then put the results into this file here, separated by semicolons. And I've put that into the table here, so it's perhaps a bit more readable. It counts all the statements the item has, how many violations there are on the different levels, how many statements have violations. So earlier, for instance, we had 3 different violations, but on just one statement. And then also generally how many site links, how many Wikipedia site links the item has, and what its score in ORAS is. So you can decide to focus on the constraint violations in the highest or lowest scored items, for instance. And what I forgot to put on the slide here is it can also pull some random item IDs and then run constraint checks against those. So you can just find random constraint violations and try to work your way through those, I guess. And I think that's it. I'm not sure if we have time for any questions. There's definitely been something going on in the chat that I haven't looked at. But otherwise, yeah, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lucas. There's been some discussion in the chat indeed, but Lydia was very fast and already answered it. So let's see. One of the questions was, does the tool also include lexemes? And I think the answer is yes, right?
Constraints can be checked on lexemes. I'm not sure if this constraints violation checker works on lexemes or not. But constraints themselves should definitely work there as well. And I think there's even constraint, lexeme-specific constraint types.
And then there was a discussion going on about aligning these constraints with the database reports. And yeah, there was a discussion about how both are helpful, but could be maybe more like connected. And Lydia was pointing out to a fabricator ticket where this is discussed. I guess that could also be brought at the bug triage hour if you feel like this ticket deserves some more love. And then finally, just to remind you that there will be another session related to Constraint. It's going to be the Constraint-a-thon that is taking place on Sunday. So if you want to come and play around with constraints, you can join this session. Let me see if I see some more questions. Is the script reading the information stored by the bot or collecting in real time?
This script is running against the API, and the API can return cached results, but as far as I know, it always, if the results are out of date, then it checks them again. So it should always be up to date, except for type constraints, which are sometimes cached in the queries because we don't want to send the Spark query all the time. But it should be pretty much in real time.
All right, thank you.